Bem, eu se calhar vou até do início também. Vamos ignorar tudo o que eu fiz até aqui também. Isto é de um lado para o outro, de um lado para o outro. Vai, só. Ok.
Well, I've been working in sound design for 25 years now. And when I built studio 12 years ago, I started also doing music recording, mixing and mastering. Then a few years ago, I decided to start producing my music projects because I wanted to gain control over the full process from choosing the right musicians to the recording, the mixing and mastering process. I started to love music, hi-fi and films mainly influenced by my father at a very, very early age. Actually, these were his favorite hobbies. He had a very nice hi-fi setup at home with a Revox reel-to-reel tape machine, Torrents turntable and some big Wharfdale speakers. And he also had this big classical music record collection, and every Saturday he went to the movies and he would take me along. Then when I was 18, I started writing film reviews for a local newspaper and for a radio station. At the radio, I started to do the sound editing of my film reviews because that was much more fun than to just speak about movies. I love to cut magnetic tape and do all the mix of the show. Those were happy days for a young man like I was. So some years later, I went to film school and got my degree in film sound design. And fortunately, from day to night, I was working in first private TV broadcast station in Portugal. Because I was doing the night shift alone, I had the chance of testing a lot of things by myself. Of course, I've always read a lot of audio magazines, from hi-fi to professional sound, books about audio, about acoustics, but most important, I've always listened to a lot of music and watched many, many films. I still do. Well, I have to be honest. As a listener, I prefer classical music and film scores. But while working, I truly enjoy jumping from classical music or film scores to other types of music projects, as long as I can manage to give them very good sound. The same happens as a listener at home, going from a realistic Beethoven symphony recording to a Michael Jackson album. As long as they have very good sound, I truly enjoy both. And I like to work that way. I don't want to be typecasted in a type of music. Truly, I think it's very fun to do a decade-3 orchestral recording while trying to use only the 5 main microphones. But at the same time, I enjoy the same level of fun while recording or mixing pop music with lots of delays, digital reverb and hard pans. I think it's fun. Sound is very irrational for human beings. It works in a very primitive way in our mind. Most people can't understand that. Sometimes people don't like a movie, a music album or a concert just because of the way the sound was done. But they can't guess that because sound works in a strange way for most of them. That is what I truly love the most in sound. You can bring a movie or a music album to another level of acceptance from the audience just with good sound, and for me that power is wonderful. On the other side, visuals affects our mind in a completely different way. I think we are much more analytical about what we see, so we understand better how a picture affects us. Well, for me, detail and clarity come in a very instinctive way. So when I'm working, I'm always trying to imprint those qualities in my recordings and in sound of each film. I just can't get along with that kind of stuff you see nowadays, very often in music and films. Just a full wall of sound without any layers of small elements. And unfortunately, I think we are starting to see that more and more often, even in classical music, where there are so many recordings nowadays, just aiming for the loudness and the impact of the full orchestra. In my work, I like the listener to feel each layer and each small element that makes the full sound. But at the same time, I never let them get distracted by any of these small things. I think that's the most difficult thing to achieve in sound, to find the right balance between focus or detail and the overall soundscape. There's always this big question about why and when did people stop buying music and records. And as a rule, everybody says it's a problem that came with digital audio and the digital society. Frankly, I do not agree with that. For me, the big question should always be why and when did musicians, producers and sound engineers decided to make rated Z albums? My generation was used to put a record on the turntable and listen to an album from the beginning to the last song on the B-side during the 80s. Today people just don't listen to an whole album in streaming or in YouTube because they don't get the same level of fun they used to have. In my opinion, a lot of the music that is being made and recorded today lacks quality, from composition to the sound, and in an irrational way listeners feel that. So I think the main challenge today is to make better albums, not the hit single recorded in the hotel room that everybody will soon forget. And maybe the industry will start to understand this with vinyl. It's ironic, but maybe that whole replay system will be bringing everybody back to those times when music was playing for 40 minutes in a row in someone's living room. But I repeat, I think we need to make good albums that will deserve that ritual from their listeners. Well, I think we can go back to what I'm always looking to achieve in my work, detail and clarity. Of course, it will be more difficult for me to achieve those things if I'm using hardware that's not faithful to that. And of course, I can deal with lack of good material, sure, but it will take me more time to do the job just because somehow I will be working in the dark, so to say. So, at this stage of my life, I'm always looking for hardware and software that go along with those main points, detail and clarity. But I'm not that type of person that spends too much money on material just because they are expensive or in fashion. For me, quality-price ratio is the main point. If top quality comes with an out of proportion price, I just don't think it's worth it. Well, most audio components somehow always depend on something very important that many sound professionals and hi-fi buffs keep underrating: the dimensions and the acoustics of the space they are in. For me, that's the fundamental equation in sound. You have to use the right microphone in the right acoustics, or choose the correct amplifier and speakers for that space. So I never choose a favorite piece of hardware. When I have to choose my favorite work instrument, I always go for the space where I'm recording. That might be a church or a small studio booth, and where I'm listening during the recording, during the mix, and during the mastering. So to get more practical, my studio is my favorite component in the whole process, because I made it with the right acoustics for my work and for the material. So the studio interacts with speakers in the best way you can think of, and is versatile enough to go from music to film with the most detailed sound one can get in each area of work. So my favorite work instrument, this is it. Well, that's a long story. Before I had studio, some 20 years ago, I had the BMW 801 Nautilus at home. At the time, I was trying to push them with some THX amplifiers, but they weren't getting any load at all, even with the amplifiers on bridge mode. Then I remembered to read something about how the Nimbus were made for those speakers at Abbey Road, so I bought them, my first 3 units actually. But I didn't buy them just because they were using it at Abbey Road. I remember to test them side by side with a very well-known high-end amplifier, and these were 5 times the cost of Nimbus, but I just loved the sound of Nimbus. They had all the detail and clearness I was looking for, and they were pushing the speakers very easily without getting harsh. They were very musical, in a word. So some years later, when I started making plans about having an audiophile 5.1 studio with 5 new BMW 801 Diamond speakers, I just went for Nimbus. I got some more units, and here we are with 5 Nimbus around us. So I truly think they are the best amplifiers in the world. They sound very sweet and warm with music source, but they have the detail and clearness that you usually don't get with sweet and warm amplifiers. And they just give you a big punch and lots of dynamics when I'm mixing films, and I need that when I'm mixing films. So I think they are the best sounding and most versatile amplifiers I got to know to this day. And last but not least, they have a very high quality over price ratio. So I rest my case. When people ask me that question, I always remember Roger Deakins. He's probably one of the 2 best film cinematographers alive, and is using nowadays digital cameras, each one smaller than the previous one. Still, the films he's been shooting today, they look like they were made using the best analog Kodak film. So it's not the stuff you use, it's how you use it. For example, I know some analog recordings that sound very harsh, and some digital ones that sound too soft. But I have to confess that I prefer digital recording for classical music or film score, and analog somewhere in the chain for pop rock music. Anyway, my studio is fully digital. I think nowadays plugins are so good in recreating old vintage analog sound that you can work totally in the box without going for any analog material. But going for a full digital signal was a choice I've made since the beginning of the studio. Still, I do love my analog Revox, and I'm still using it in some projects. Well, as I told you, I mostly enjoy classical music, mainly the romantic composers, and also film scores. But I do love to listen to most of pop music from the 80s. Maybe I'm getting old, I don't know. They were very well recorded and mixed. And the funny thing is that most of young listeners, those who enjoy the sound of hip-hop and rap music today, they are totally ignorant about the roots of that type of sound. It all started with Michael Jackson and the sound of Bruce Sweden. Well, as we speak, I'm finishing the sound design of a film and moving to a music recording project. Two completely different things, but I always like to do that. Somehow it clears my mind about music when I go back to film and vice versa. And I'm also starting a new project of getting my hands on dirt by writing and producing a feature movie. And I'm also putting some music projects running by giving full support to some talented and unknown singers and musicians all over the world. So if you know any, you can send them over.